Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the Executive has been discussing the roadmap towards emerging from the restrictive measures COVID has had us living under. I know that people want to get back to normal as soon as possible and have certainty as to when that might be. However, it can only be a gradual and phased normalisation and reliant on the expert scientific advice. The Economy Minister is also working on a further paper dedicated to economic recovery, which will dovetail with the roadmap and be published subsequently in the coming days. While the Executive continues to liaise closely with the UK Government, with our counterparts in Wales and Scotland, and also with the Irish Government, the reality is that devolved administrations are going to diverge slightly and at particular points in time, mindful of the different circumstances in each region, including the stage the spread of the disease is at. However, we remain committed to working closely with all administrations, sharing information and insights on COVID-19. To that end, we welcome the announcement by the Prime Minister on the establishment of a new joint biosecurity centre to monitor the levels of infection and identify specific actions in regions where spikes occur. The devolved administrations will participate in and contribute to its work. Last Thursday, the Executive decided to keep Northern Ireland's restrictions in place for a further 3 weeks, with just some minor adjustments to be considered over the next few days. The current advice from the Executive remains to stay at home as much as possible, to respect the 2-metre social distancing rule at all times when in public, and continue to wash your hands thoroughly and regularly. And if you live apart from elderly relatives and other family members, you must continue to avoid direct contact with them in their homes. You should only go out in public to shop for basic necessities, get medicines, exercise, or to work in line with the coronavirus regulations. The Executive agreed last week, however, that we need to enhance the messaging around what people are permitted to do. There is scope for clearer messaging from departments to different sectors of the economy, such as construction and manufacturing. It's not surprising that people are erring on the side of caution and not engaging in activities that are, in fact, permissible, safe and beneficial. This is understandable given the extremely unusual and worrying times in which we are living. The Executive agreed to consider messaging aimed at giving people the knowledge and confidence to enable them to live their lives as freely as possible within the existing legislative constraints and in line with public health advice, including a safe return to work. The Department of Health has committed to taking this forward with other departments. After 8 weeks of lockdown, I know many of you are desperate to get back to the life you had before this health emergency erupted. I know I am. You want to see your family and friends. You want to hug those close to you that you haven't been able to see. Grandparents especially want to be able to see their grandchildren. Many of you also want to get back into a routine of work and of study. However, as the First and Deputy First Minister have repeatedly said, we all need to be realistic about what life will be like in the months ahead. There will be no dramatic lifting of restrictions. Each step will be incremental and cautious. Social distancing is going to be with us for a very long time. Just as it has become a reality of how we shop, it will be a reality of how we work together, study together, how we socialise, and even how we worship. As the First Minister keeps saying, it would be a grave mistake to assume that we have beat COVID-19. It would be reckless to act as if we had. Once the Executive Roadmap is published, all of us will still have a role to play in containing the spread of this invisible killer virus if we are to continue to keep the pressure off our brave health workers. The way to do that is to listen to the public health advice issued by the Executive and to continue to follow that advice. We don't just owe it to the NHS, we owe it to each and every one of our fellow citizens. Declan.
Gormaigad Gordon, agus war géad bhailteas Jack ag pras agalu an lei aniu. Good afternoon, everyone. Sadly, today we have had confirmation of another 3 deaths as a result of COVID-19, bringing the total death ratio in this region to 438. We send our condolences to the families of those individuals and indeed to all of those who have lost loved ones. As always, the loss of life to COVID-19 is a stark daily reminder to us all that we are very much still in a critical situation in our response to this pandemic. Boris Johnson took to the airwaves yesterday to set out his plan for England as they begin to look at their own measures and messages. But we cannot allow that to become a distraction to the very clear message coming from this executive to stay at home and save lives. There should be no confusion about the clarity of our public health message. Our public message remains: stay home, save lives. We are still in the response phase to this pandemic, but of course the executive is working intensively to prepare for our future recovery. And I want to assure citizens this afternoon that the executive is taking a pragmatic and a considered approach to our own pathway for recovery that is right for us here in this region. We have had a detailed and positive discussion about that strategy today, and I'm pleased that the executive made further progress on our plan for how our society can begin to embark on a pathway towards recovery. Further work will need to be done on that plan over the next 24 hours to reflect the views of our 5-party power-sharing executive. And when finalised, we hope to bring that document before the Assembly tomorrow and communicate the detail with the public. Until then, we can tell you that the plan is a gradual, incremental strategy over 5 stages that are framed in a set of guiding principles. These principles will be applied in considering whether or not to ease specific restrictions at any given point in the future. Our regulations will continue to be reviewed on a 3-week cycle, and any decisions taken by the executive will be informed by, firstly, the latest medical and scientific advice. Secondly, the ability of the health service to cope. And thirdly, an assessment of the wider health, societal and economic impacts. And that will mean identifying the areas with greatest benefit and lowest risk. No decision that our executive takes around easing the restrictions will be easy. Each will need to be carefully balanced. It's important that they are informed by the best possible scientific evidence and best practice, both internationally and locally. It is not only prudent, but it is necessary in our approach that the executive considers global experiences of this pandemic elsewhere in the world. That we draw on the international expertise, scientific and medical advice, and the lessons learned. Our approach will be closely aligned with the World Health Organization's guidance. By adopting an approach that is informed by the science, it is also crucial that we do not set arbitrary timeframes for easing certain restrictions. We must retain the flexibility to respond to the emerging situation and achieve the best possible outcomes for all of our people. The past 6 weeks have been among the most challenging times for people in living memory. It has been particularly demanding for citizens with special needs, our elderly, and our most vulnerable. It has placed unprecedented emotional and physical demands on our healthcare workers and all of their families. And you, the public, have done amazingly well in abiding by the restrictions and following the public health advice. As we begin to move out of full lockdown, slowly, incrementally, and carefully, there will still be very challenging times ahead of us all. We will still be asking a great deal from citizens. We will all need to adhere to the restrictions that are in place at any given time and not to step outside of that for any reason. We need a partnership approach between government and community. The better we all stick to the measures and the public health advice, the sooner we will be able to come through this together. Míle buíochas, Steve. Thank you.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Tracy McGee, UTV. Can I ask this pathway that's going to be unveiled tomorrow, how dependent is it on the UK government, given that it will have to write the checks on the big financial plans, such as the furlough scheme? And how compatible will it be with the Irish model, given that if it isn't compatible, it could be very difficult for people living on the border?
Thanks, Tracy. We've been closely engaged with the British government, engaged with the Welsh and the Scottish administrations, and of course, on a north-south basis, with the Dublin government. The reality is, and our scientific advisors have confirmed this for us, the trajectory or the pathway of the pandemic is here on the island. Therefore, we need to follow the pathway. We need to adjust the decisions that we make on the basis of what that tells us from a scientific and a medical perspective, while at the same time ensuring that the communication lines are kept open on an east-west and a north-south basis, and ensuring that to the greatest extent possible, we work in a collaborative way. However, in the first instance, our power-sharing executive has direct responsibility for the health and the well-being and the welfare of the citizens who live in this region. And to that extent then, we will be guided by what is best to ensure that lives are saved and the public health of our people in the north is maintained.
Thanks for your question, Tracy. And obviously, first and foremost, what we're concerned about is the health and well-being of our citizens. And that's why we have taken the decision that we have to continue with the regulations that are currently in place. And that will always be what guides us first and foremost. In terms of the furlough scheme that you refer to, that's obviously going to be a decision for the Chancellor as to when that changes and how that comes about. But to my knowledge, there has been no change in announcement on that at the minute, and that firms can continue to apply to that if people are not able to go to work for whatever reason, or if their work has been affected by coronavirus.
Hello, both of you. Mark Denport, BBC Northern Ireland. A couple of points. You mentioned that the rules are reviewed every 3 weeks. So once we get on this path to recovery, will there be a kind of 3-weekly decision as to which stage we go into? Or could you make what I think Arlene Foster has described as nuanced changes over things like garden centres, acts of private prayers on a day-to-day basis? And then the second issue I just wanted to ask about, Boris Johnson has told MPs he's got this plan potentially for quarantine for international travellers coming in, but that it won't apply to the common travel area, to the Irish Republic. Have you had any liaison whatsoever with your counterparts in the Irish government as to how they would administer that? Because obviously, unless you know who's coming in from abroad and potentially travelling over the border, the quarantine scheme seems to have a rather large hole in it.
What's envisaged is that we will set out a plan which will be encompassing a staged approach. The continued use of the 3 weekly reviews will be benchmarks or moments throughout the trajectory of the executive's approach. Therefore, at any given moment in time, we will be operating with a staged or a phased approach, which is directly informed then on a 3-weekly interval by the best available and most up-to-date scientific and medical advice at that point in time. However, there will be sufficient latitude and flexibility, which is absolutely governed by the scientific information at that point in time, to consider whether it is possible to make modifications at any stage as we move along. However, it must be said, no changes were made during the course of the last review. And the reason for that was because we are still in a critical situation. We have not sufficiently moved to a point of being able to suppress the pandemic within our midst. The indications that we receive are that it still remains around the ratio of 0.8. That is much too high. That is much too high and unpredictable a level of contagion and infection within society. Therefore, as we move forward, we must be doing things and only doing things which guarantees that we are, on the one hand, suppressing the pandemic and at the same time ensuring that we are in a position to make changes that in no way infringe on the public health message or in adherence to social distancing, which is so critical. In respect of the last point, your second question, we have been involved in detailed discussions with the British government in relation to this issue. We've also had communications with the Irish government, and the other regional administrations have been part of that process as well. Myself and Gordon took part in a conversation last week in relation to how this particular issue would and should be addressed. There is an acceptance amongst all of the administrations, our own government, the British government, and the Scotch and the Welsh, that there is effectively a common travel area between these islands, and that's the appropriate stance to adopt. However, individuals who would travel into these islands from abroad will then be expected to accept a 2-week lockdown and isolation period. And we have made the point to the British government that in circumstances where perhaps someone would travel into Britain from continental Europe or from elsewhere, who may then travel forward across the Irish Sea into the north, but whose final destination would be in the 26 counties, that those details are shared with the authorities in the south in order that they can maintain a consistency of their approach in checking in on individuals who should be adhering to a 2-week isolation.
Yes, Mark, as you'll be aware, there is a legislative requirement for us to review the regulations as an executive every 3 weeks, and that may well be the point where we decide to move to the next stage, but that doesn't mean that it's automatically going to be the case. We need to listen to the advice from the Chief Scientific Officer and the Chief Medical Officer to decide whether or not to go to that next stage. However, the First Minister did say today, and she's right, that there may be nuance changes that we can make, and the executive can make changes to the regulations at any time. It doesn't need to be at those 3-week staging posts. So you mentioned in particular garden centres. It may be the case that the advice comes back that social distancing can be maintained and that could go ahead. We also have to think of the other effects, for example, on people's mental health, the positive benefits that could come from that. In addition, we're trying to get people to stay at home. It might be easier to do that if they're able to do more work in the garden. In terms of solitary prayer, as a Christian, I believe and understand the importance of prayer. Solitary prayer in churches is not part of my tradition or background, but if people can do that in a safe way where social distancing can be maintained and the rate of infection isn't increased, then if we can bring some comfort to people that want to do that, then we should allow them to do that. Declan's absolutely right in relation to the continuous cooperation that we have had with the British with the government and in different parts of the UK in and around the issue of quarantine. There will be a working group that's going to be set up so that we can ensure that proper exemptions are in place, and obviously it's important that the common travel area is maintained, and that will require further conversations with our own government and with the Irish government as well.
Afternoon, Ministers. You'll be aware Boris Johnson, in his address last night, set out that he would also be increasing or potentially increasing fines in England, and alongside some relaxation in social distancing, the lockdown measures. Do you anticipate any similar move in Northern Ireland in respect of potentially increasing the fines that could be administered as through the regulations as we move on through this phased process that you're discussing about? And then just a question specifically for Minister Kearney. A couple of weeks ago, drew a lot of attention from remarks he made in regard to his concerns about right-wing elements within the cabinet in the UK and some unionists in the north of Ireland that were effectively, from his point of view, prioritising the market economy over public health. Does he retain those concerns when reflecting on what's been published by the government in London last night, and in regard to his colleagues in the executive, does he count any of those among the unionists he mentioned 2 weeks ago?
Clearly, as we move forward with this plan, it's going to depend consistently upon the public's willingness to adhere to the social distancing guidelines. So the challenge for the public in respect of that is not going to change. But the reality is that, as I said earlier, we have still a very critical situation. And to some extent, there has been some fraying at the edges in relation to an adherence to our social distancing guidance, notwithstanding the fact that the greater majority of our people have been very, very disciplined and have moderated their behaviour in quite an exemplary way. So it is essential that as we maintain restrictions, as we move forward on an incremental, staged, gradual and careful pathway towards recovery, that there is a continued reliance upon behavioural discipline, but equally that, if necessary, enforcement is available to ensure that we maximise the effect of the public health message, that we ensure we continue to save lives, and that our citizens come through this in the safest way possible. And that is another matter which will be kept under ongoing review by the executive in the coming period, just as the issue of enforcement has been a matter of ongoing consideration up until this particular point in time. I'm very pleased, David, that my article on Unfoblat continues to resonate and that it seems to have had something of a lasting effect. But you're quite right, it was 3 weeks ago. So I hope that you'll take a keen interest in the next blog when it's written in the very near future also.
I think it is important to point out that the vast majority of people have been adhering to the regulations that the Northern Ireland Executive have brought in. Obviously, there have been a small number of people that haven't been doing that, and the police have taken, obviously, an approach, first of all, of explaining why they are doing something they shouldn't be doing, and then, obviously, trying to encourage people to disperse before we get to the enforcement stage. In terms of any increase in the number of fines, or the value of the fines, that would obviously need to be based on evidence. We need to work out whether or not the fines have been working up to this point, and whether an increase in the fines would be beneficial or not. We've no problem finding that information out, doing that analysis, and taking whatever action is appropriate following that.
Hi, Mark Bain here, Belfast Telegraph. Just in relation to mixed messages, we had Boris Johnson obviously go on TV nationwide across all 4 regions last night. Do you think that created possibly a danger that people in Northern Ireland will follow Boris Johnson's advice rather than listen to what the Northern Ireland executives say? Just one further thing on the threat that has been made by loyalists to journalists and several politicians over the weekend. Is that something that the country needs right now? What have you got to say about those?
Thank you, Mark. The purpose of this press conference today is to very sharply reinforce the primacy of our public health message, which is stay home, save lives. That's what the scientific information we have at our disposal is telling us at this stage. Stay home, save lives. That's the message that we want to ensure continues to be adhered to within our wider society. We are in a critical situation. We are not out of the woods yet. I do think that there is the potential for a confused acoustic arising from the message which was issued by Boris Johnson yesterday evening. But you will note from the response of the Scottish administration, the Welsh government, and then the clarity with which we have approached this issue as a power-sharing executive today, that is not the page that we are on. We are still at a point where we are dealing with COVID-19. We are in the midst of that battle, and therefore it is essential that no one gets mesmerised or distracted by what has been said last night. The message that we want people to take away from this press conference today is that the Executive speaks with one clear, united voice, and that is to maintain the public health message which we have been providing you with over the course of recent weeks. And in respect of the other matter, these threats are despicable. There is no place for them at this within this society. Those responsible should pack up their bags, they should disband, they should go away, and they should allow all of the rest of us and all fair and reasonable minded people to get on with the real priorities in this society, which is ensuring that we save lives, we maintain the public health message, but that we work together in a joined up way, a whole of society and a whole of government approach towards developing a pathway beyond COVID-19. And what these people have done is an anathema to all of that.
Well, look, I think that people are able to see that there are different approaches taken in different parts of the UK, and some rules that may apply in England don't apply in Northern Ireland, and vice versa. It's always been the case that the 4 regions of the UK have taken a different approach. We have different regulations, and there have always been nuanced differences between that, and that shouldn't surprise us. In fact, I actually believe that that's one of the benefits of devolution, is that each country can adapt their messaging and adapt their approach depending on their own circumstances. As for us, we're committed to the right outcome for Northern Ireland. That's why we've taken the steps that we outlined last week, and why we will produce our roadmap tomorrow. In terms of the threats, journalists play a very important part in our society, and just like politicians, they should be able to get on with their job. There is no room, no place whatsoever for threats. It is wrong. Those threats should be withdrawn, and people should be able to get on with their lives and on with their jobs. Okay, folks, thank you.